Hey guys, Dave with First Place Auto Parts, and we're in the studio today. And one of the things that we get questions about is what's the right kind of shock absorber for my classic American muscle car or truck? And look, it may not be as straightforward as you might think. And in today's video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the difference between gas charged shocks and traditional hydraulic shocks that are not gas charged. So guys, stay tuned to today's video. We're going to tell you what's right for your application and also explain a little bit what's the difference between gas charged and hydraulic shocks, so you better understand what you're looking to get and what you're buying once you get them for your project. So guys, stay tuned. Hey guys, if you like today's video, please consider subscribing to the First Place Auto Parts YouTube channel. We're going to continually be adding new videos every week where we show you how to put new parts on. We take a look at the latest parts that are available, and we go to some pretty cool car guy stuff I'm pretty sure you're going to want to see. Shock absorbers are one of those parts that are kind of out of sight, out of mind, in that we never really give them a lot of thought until it's time to upgrade our suspension or we see some fluid leaking somewhere and we can't figure out where it is. Shock absorbers play an important role not on how your vehicle rides, but also the overall comfort and how certain components like your tires wear. A shock absorber, what it is meant to do is control essentially the spring, the reaction of the spring. For every action, there's a reaction, and when you compress a coil spring on a car, what it wants to do is push back, and that's where a shock absorber comes in. Not only does it slow down the travel as that spring compresses, but as importantly, as that spring reloads or rebounds, the shock absorber slows that whole motion down. If you didn't have a shock absorber or you have bad shock absorbers, what you get is a very springy ride. The car and the body responds to everything, and the suspension, and more importantly the tire, doesn't stay planted on the ground. And when shocks go bad, they do it slowly over time. It's kind of like gaining weight, guys. You don't really realize your shocks are bad until you realize your shocks are bad. If you've ever seen a car that continued to bounce at a stoplight, that's because nothing's controlling that spring and that shock absorber's blown. So shock absorbers play an important role in how your car rides, but also how it handles. And the handling part of it is that this thing helps the wheel follow the ground or the road, the undulations of the road. Again, that spring is really pretty crude. All it wants to do is keep it from compressing, and when it compresses, it wants to rebound as fast as possible. The wheel, if it didn't have a shock absorber, if you've ever pulled a trailer that does not have shocks on the axles and it's unloaded, you'll see that thing basically bounce all over the place. And that's what your front and your rear wheels would do if you didn't have shocks. These things help the wheels follow the terrain better. They also give you a better ride. Now today you basically have two types of shocks. One would be a gas charged shock like the one I have here, and the other is a non-gas charged, or what we just call a hydraulic shock. A lot of your classic muscle cars, they were designed and built around traditional hydraulic shocks. And the reason when you put a gas charged shock on your classic American muscle car or truck and all of a sudden your ride feels stiffer without doing anything else is because you probably put a gas charged shock on it. Now look, vehicles that were made in the 60s, 70s, and even into the early 80s were designed, the suspension was designed to use a hydraulic shock. If you get your new hydraulics or your new gas charged shocks, what you're going to do when you pull it out of the box is typically you're going to find a baling wire that's wrapped around these things, and the shock is compressed. Some people think that that's for packaging, and it's not. It's so that it gives you a chance, once you uncut that wire and this shock starts to expand, that you have a chance to put the bolts in, because it can be very hard to compress. What we are talking about when we talk about suspension, especially springs and shocks, essentially are spring rates, or the rate that they're rated at. And what that means is, say a classic American muscle car front coil spring would be rated somewhere around 100 to 150 pounds. And what that means is it takes 100 to 150 pounds of force to get that spring to initiate its travel. A gas charged shock, it can start off with anywhere from 50 to 75 pounds of initial spring rate, which means essentially it takes 75 to 50 pounds to compress the shock. As a matter of fact, I'm not 75 or 50 pounds, and it's hard to compress just sitting here on the bench. And then it immediately returns. So gas charged shocks, they tend to transmit more of the irregularities of the road to the suspension. They don't help increase spring rate necessarily, but in combination of that 100 to 150 pounds of spring rate, you're also adding 50 to 75 pounds of spring rate to that initial travel. And that's why gas charged shocks, when you put them on a classic American muscle car or truck, it tends to feel maybe the ride's a little sporty, but now you start to feel every ripple in the road where you didn't before. And that's because you put gas charged shocks. Now, the reason we have gas charged shocks is that the gas that's inside these actual cylinders, it helps keeps the shock fluid from aerating. And there's a piston inside here with holes, and as this shock goes through its travel and it compresses and releases, not only is it generating a lot of heat, but it also can aerate the oil. And aerated oil is nothing more than oil that has air in it. And with air, what you get is suspension characteristics or damping characteristics can change because air is compressible and the fluid inside these shocks are not. So gas charged shocks, especially with high performance applications and when you get into longer travel shocks, gas charged shocks make a lot of sense. They help keep the consistency of the shock travel consistent. But the reality is most of us aren't taking our classic American muscle car, 69 Chevelle or 65 Mustang, out to Mulholland Drive and turning corners with it all day long. And in that case, a set of hydraulic shocks that were designed for the car will not only restore the car to its original ride quality, but it's going to make the car more comfortable to ride. And the suspension, quite honestly, is going to work the way it was designed. You can add gas charged shocks to a classic American muscle car or truck. It's just going to ride a little firmer, and that's what you have to know up front. Look, they're not going to increase your spring rate. If you have a classic truck, you're not going to be able to haul more weight in the bed of your truck just because you put these gas charged shocks on, but it will make the vehicle feel a little sportier. Gas charged and hydraulic shocks both have their place. The thing that you need to understand is what your application is going to be. Look, gas charged shocks, they're going to maintain their dampening rates even when these things get hot. Where hydraulic shocks, as the fluid starts to get hot, it starts to thin out and the dampening starts to decrease. So hydraulic shocks have their place, especially when it comes to ride quality, but gas charged shocks, look, they offer a lot of benefits as well. I haven't talked anything about, and it's also part of shock absorber and spring rates, but unsprung weight. When you add lighter wheels to your car, or maybe even rotors that are lighter than what it originally came with, or calipers that are no longer cast iron and now are aluminum, that all comes into play in regards to the shock dampening. And in a future video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the different kind of shocks, and more specifically the piggyback reservoir type shocks, but also the shocks that you can adjust the rebound and compression dampening on. Look, those are cool and you can tune those things, and I do recommend those. But for today's video, hydraulic versus gas charged shocks, look, they both have their place. Gas charged good, but you know what? Don't kid yourself, hydraulic shocks still have their place and they cost a whole bunch less. Guys, I appreciate you watching this video, and if you need parts for your American muscle car truck, check us out at firstplaceautoparts.com. There we have everything you need to make your car look better, go faster, or stop harder. Guys, until next time, keep the hammer down and keep it between the guardrails.